The last characteristic that we need to focus on is the spread of a distribution. Now again, there's more than one way to describe the spread. In this part, we're looking at the variation from the center. So we're talking about how far from the middle value are all of the values spread out. Is it tightly clustered, so everything's sort of together around that one mode, or is it really spread out and a lot of different values? One way to describe the spread is using the range. And the range is the difference between the minimum and maximum of a data set. So here, looking at the range of this data, I would take 89 minus 13, and that would give me my range. So the range would be 76. I might also mention that the values range from 13 to 89. So don't just say the range is 76 and move on from there, because it's important to understand what the actual data values are. In addition to just the range, we also look at percentiles and quartiles. And percentiles and quartiles are going to be used a lot in this course, so please take the time to try to understand this. So a percentile basically breaks the data into 100 groups. That means it's now a percentile. So the nth percentile is the data value such that n% of the data lies below that value. So if I'm dealing with, say, a normal curve, which we'll do a lot in this class, looking at the 50th percentile would mean that half of my data is to this side. Looking at the 30th percentile would mean that 30% of my data is to the left side. So it's important that it lies below. It's less than that value. So for large data sets, the median, which is our middle value, is the 50th percentile, which makes sense because we just talked about the median being the middle half of the data. The median of the lower half of the data, meaning, okay, here I've got my data from 0 to 100. The 50th percentile is obviously in the middle. If I take the middle of the first half, that's the 25th percentile, and it's called the first quartile. The middle of the top half, the second half of data, is halfway between the 50th and 100th percentile, and that's the 75th percentile, which is Q3. So these are quartiles, like quarters, which means we're broken into 4. So the median is like our second quartile, but we call it the median instead. So another way to describe our spread, other than just the range, is to use the interquartile range. So the interquartile range basically says, find your Q3 and find your Q1, and then find the difference between those two. So instead of taking my highest value minus my lowest, I'm taking my upper quartile minus my lower quartile. And that gives us the middle half of the data. So it's another way that we can talk about the spread. It tells us where the middle half of the data, how much distance there is between those values. So here, looking at this graph, let's talk about the shape, center, and spread now that we've talked about all of those things. So looking at the shape, I can see that it's unimodal. I can also see that the mode is at about -2. It seems to be skewed to the left because I can see that there is a distance here. It looks like I have an outlier here. Whether or not this one's an outlier, hard to tell until I teach you how to do some calculations to determine if it is an outlier. This one certainly is because it's far, far away from the rest of the data. There appears to be some gaps here that I would talk about. The center appears to be about -2. The spread, I would say that the spread is, most of the data go from -0.6 to 0, but that we have some extreme values. So shape, center, spread, again, here's the values or the ideas that we just talked about.